Information is now virtually unlimited, it's ubiquitous, and it's free. IBM recently published a report that estimated that we now generate, every day, 2.5 quintillion bytes of information. And if 2.5 quintillion is a number that trips off your tongue, that's 2.5 followed by 18 zeros. And if that doesn't make sense, if I printed it out in books, it would fill a bookcase that went around the Earth at the equator 40,000 miles and was half a kilometer high. Every day. Or alternatively, I can say that each of you, that is each of the 7.4 billion people on the planet, produces 185,000 pages a day. All of it's not carefully edited. So virtually unlimited information and ubiquitous. How many people here have a phone with them? I don't actually have a phone. I live in this wonderful bubble of tranquility. But you could whip out your phone, and assuming you paid your monthly charges, a couple thumbs, and you've got access to any of that information. So it's ubiquitous and it's free. Now, this has been celebrated as a transformational moment in society. We've moved into the knowledge economy. There are some downsides, however. For example, I had a student some years ago who was struggling in my class, and unlike a lot of students, she actually came to office hours for help, so that was good. But at one point, we were doing a difficult problem, and I was trying to lead her through it in a Socratic method. And at one point, she just burst out in frustration, "But Professor Helfand, I Google your problems and nothing comes back." The notion being that typing into the upper right-hand corner of your browser is the equivalent of thinking. And unfortunately, it's not. This tremendous democratization of information has been celebrated endlessly, but I'm not so sure it's a totally good thing. Because there's another aspect of the information that we have today and the information we had throughout all of prehistory. That information in prehistory was existentially important. You had to find food, avoid becoming food, reproduce. Those are sort of the Richard Dawkins rules of what genes do. And therefore, the information that you passed on was important to be correct, and the people you passed it on to were those in your group who you wanted to survive. E.O. Wilson recently published a book called The Social Conquest of Earth, which has some wonderful theorems in it, and I'm a little afraid this is going to push Professor Dawkins' buttons a little bit, but one of his theorems is a selfish person will almost always outcompete an altruistic person, but a group of altruists will always outcompete a group of selfish people. The group which shared information about where the good fruit was and where the good hunting was shared information, good information, and it worked. And the group where someone went off and gathered all the poisonous berries, well, they were quickly eliminated from the gene pool. And the person that went off and led the hunters to the hungry lions instead of the grazing zebras, well, they were either eliminated by the hungry lions from the gene pool or by his or her compatriots. So the information quality was really good. And that's because the information you were transferring was to someone you knew, someone whose survival you cared about, someone whose your survival might depend on. But this, of course, is no longer the case. If you've never met, don't know, and don't care about the survival of the person you transfer information to, the threshold for accuracy goes way down. And that's, of course, what we see on the web. If you can gain power or money or fame, or if you're a politician, power and money and fame, by propagating misinformation or deliberate disinformation on the web to hundreds of millions of people, not just the ones in your group, why not do it? It pays. The consequences of this are severe because most of the stuff on the web is garbage. And let me give you a couple of examples of how this impacts decisions, both that individuals make about medical care, financial interests, even writing a paper for class, and how it affects, more importantly, our public policy formation. Imagine a ninth grader goes into science class, gets told, okay, I picked you on Thursday, you're going to go home, and you're going to come back on Thursday and give the class a presentation on the age of the Earth. How do we know how old the Earth is? And you should look up radioactive dating because that's an important part of this. And don't just give me the Wikipedia article. I want you to really do some research. So I did this. I typed in age of the Earth radioactive dating. Of the first 6 articles that come up, 4 of them claim the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. The first, extremely well written, beautiful diagrams explaining how radioactivity doesn't work, citing papers from Nature and Science and major magazines, with an author with the 3 PhD letters after his name, written in very accessible prose and making a detailed argument about how some people think the age of the Earth is much older, but we've shown these radioactive techniques don't work, and here's a set of data, and the Earth is 10,000 years old. The second article is by the Us Geological Service, some of it written in such dense jargon that with a PhD in astrophysics, I couldn't understand it. So that's going to get skipped over. Then there's the Wikipedia article, but you're not supposed to just use the Wikipedia article. And then there are 3 more that show that the Earth is only 10,000 years old. Now, you might say, okay, so the student gets a C, it's not a big deal. Of course, the big deal is the student probably gets an A, which is really the problem, but that's a different issue we won't discuss. But this can get more serious. You all know about the vaccine controversy started in 1998 when Dr. Andrew Wakefield and 12 of his colleagues, researchers at a prestigious medical research hospital in London, published in Lancet, the biggest journal in biomedical research in the UK, a paper on autism and vaccines. Actually, the paper, if you read it, is fairly carefully worded, although a little flaky. But the press conference that Dr. Wakefield called is what caused the commotion. Because in it, he said he could no longer keep silent, that he had to speak out against the MMR vaccine. Giving these 3 vaccines together was causing an epidemic of autism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, what he didn't reveal in the press conference is that he'd recently received a check for £250,000 from a law firm that was representing an alternative drug company who wanted to give 3 shots instead of 1, nor did his co-authors reveal their £50,000 checks, nor did he reveal that he was unauthorized to carry out the medical procedures on the children, which were reported in the article, all 12 of them. And only because of the tenacious work over 7 years of a UK newspaper reporter did all of this information come out. Ultimately, of course, Dr. Wakefield was stripped of his ability to practice medicine in the UK, and so what did he do? He moved to Texas, where he's doing just fine. Now, you might think, well, all right, but we all know, in this room, we all know that this MMR autism thing is ridiculous because there's been lots of good double-blinded studies that have shown this is nonsense. And you might think, yeah, it's really sad that sort of the less educated people or maybe the hyper-religious people or something like that still believe in this stuff and are putting their kids at risk. Well, watch your prejudices. A year and a half ago, California State Department of Health released a wonderful map in which you could scroll over the map with your mouse and find the vaccination rate at every single kindergarten and first grade in the state of California, public and private. And the results were extremely interesting. If you went to the town of Mill Valley, which is the town right north of the Golden Gate Bridge, median house price $1.4 million, 61% of the parents had been granted a personal belief exemption, allowed under California law, so you don't have to bother to vaccinate your children. Whereas in Watsonville, a town populated 75% by Hispanic farm workers, the 5 public schools had a 100% vaccination rate. But right nearby, in Pacific Grove, a largely white and much wealthier community, the local public school had a 38% vaccination rate. If you go farther south, around Los Angeles, scroll around there, you can find the West Side Waldorf School in Los Angeles, in Pacific Palisades, 80% of the parents had registered for an exemption, whereas at both nearby Corpus Christi, a Catholic school, and the Christian Academy of Los Angeles, an evangelical school, 100% of the children were vaccinated. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this was a report done by Wired magazine, where they actually went and got the vaccination rates at the Silicon Valley tech firm daycare centers. And they found at one Google daycare facility, 50% of the children were unvaccinated. And at Pixar, 60% were unvaccinated. Now you might say, what mass irrationality is this amongst highly educated, highly successful, extremely wealthy individuals? It stems directly from the misinformation propagation aspects of the web. It's what Tom Nichols called, writing in The Federalist, the death of expertise. And I love this quote. A Google-fueled, Wikipedia-based, blog-sodden collapse of any division between professionals and laymen, students and teachers, knowers and wonderers. In other words, between those of any achievement at all in some area and those with absolutely none. This fosters the culture in which everyone's opinion is equal to everybody else's opinion. Very democratic that way. Everybody's opinion is equally valid, which is why Jenny McCarthy, whose total medical training consisted of being a Playboy bunny, is given play on the internet and on television to state that her mommy instinct, end quote, is vastly superior to the medical evidence on vaccination safety. And millions of Google-fed zombies gather this off the internet, not in agreement, and back up their foundationless opinions with this deliberate misinformation. This cornucopia of misinformation feeds another favorite American pastime, which is conspiracy theories. So a recent study of 1,511, I always want to put it in air quotes, adult Americans, but yeah, they're adult, they were all adults. 54% believe that 9/11 was a US government conspiracy. 42% believe global warming is a UN conspiracy, which is the same number as believe that aliens come and abduct people to have sex with them in their spacecraft. 30% believe Obama was born in Kenya. 30% believes the AIDS virus does not cause AIDS, which in this country hasn't been that much of an issue. But in South Africa, when both the president and the minister of health adopted that view, tens of thousands of people died as a consequence. I was a little surprised to see that the number of people who think the moon landings were a fantasy or a conspiracy is down to 24%, but that's probably because they don't know that the moon landings ever occurred or something like that. My favorite, though, was 31% of these 1,511 Americans were convinced that the North Dakota crash was a government cover-up. You know about the North Dakota crash, right? No, you don't, because the researchers made that up. And 31% think it's a government conspiracy. Now, people have written about the issue of censorship in the internet in the context of all new modes of communication. Gutenberg's printing press, the advent of radio, of movies, of television. And indeed, it's true. There have been naysayers in all of those instances that insurrection would run rife. This would be a disaster for society if the rabble got to read books or watch television or listen to the radio. And the internet is the same thing, so we shouldn't worry about this on the internet. But I think the internet is fundamentally different than those other forms of communication. When you got a book and read it, it's a personal, individual act. When you watch a TV, you might do it with your family. But what it does is it's fundamentally passive. It opens you up to other cultures, to other parts of the world, to ideas you might not have seen before. And there's no way to give feedback. I mean, you might yell at your television a lot during the debates, but there's no actual way to give feedback. And the information comes at you from the source. You don't control the source. But the internet is different because you do control the source. All of the major news outlets, from the Wall Street Journal to National Public Radio to the New York Times, now have these little apps. My New York Times, my NPR, my news, the Wall Street Journal one, I'm not picking on the Wall Street Journal because they all have it, but my news app from the Wall Street Journal boasts that you can, quote, customize your My News collections to receive only articles, videos, and slideshows from the columns, sections, industries, and companies you want. No different opinions from columnists you don't want, such as it is in the Wall Street Journal. No stories that are surprising, no information that doesn't conform to your existing worldview, just the things you want to reinforce your worldview. Frank Bruni wrote about this in the New York Times beautifully last summer, in which he said, quote, we construct precisely contoured echo chambers of affirmation that turn conviction into zeal, passion into fury, and disagreements with the other side into the demonization of it. That's why I see the internet as a qualitatively different kind of threat from the printing press or radio or television, because it provides a totally free, global medium for propagating misinformation and disinformation. The devious tribesmen that always led kin away from food supplies towards the hungry lions didn't last very long. But today, the climate change denier, the homeopathic practitioner, or the presidential candidate can easily and quickly and cheaply raise armies of the uninformed by feeding their echo chambers. Did you notice the article just last week in the New York Times about the amount spent on television advertising in the last 6 presidential campaigns? It grew and grew and grew and grew until this year when it shrank almost to zero. Because why bother when you can distribute this nonsense free over the internet? This undercuts any possibility that consumers can make rational choices for themselves about important personal decisions, and it poisons the climate for the creation of effective public policy. So what are the antidotes? Well, as someone who's been teaching in my 79th semester at Columbia, you're probably not surprised to hear that it's education. And since I just published a book, you won't be surprised to hear it's all in the book, A Survival Guide to the Misinformation Age. But what kind of things does that mean? It means being extremely careful, to start with, about the distinction between facts, models, and opinions. You heard talks yesterday about climate change, for example. Let me give you a fact that will surprise you. You have probably heard, and most of you probably believe, that climate change is a serious problem, as do I. I give lots of talks about it. But you've probably heard that one of the consequential effects of climate change is increasing intensity and numbers of hurricanes and other tropical cyclones that are going to wreak havoc in the US and around the world. Well, I looked up the numbers, and this is what the numbers say. Between 1930 and 1970, a 41-year period, in which the temperature was pretty constant. There was a little bit of a dip up towards the end, but basically that period was about the median of the last century. There were 235 North Atlantic hurricanes. Between 1971 and 2011, another 41-year period, in which the temperature rose at an unprecedented rate of nearly 0.8 of a degree centigrade over the course of 40 years, the number of hurricanes was 239. The difference between 235 and 239 is completely statistically insignificant. It doesn't even meet the psychologist's p equals 0.05, which, as we've heard in the last talk, is already a problem. You may say, oh, well, no, but it's really the massive hurricanes, the ones that do a lot of damage, not just the little old hurricanes that matter. Well, so I looked at the major hurricanes as defined by the Saffir-Simpson scale of 3 to 5, which is what the National Hurricane Center describes as a major storm. Between 1930 and 1970, there were 107. Between 1971 and 2011, there were 93, 14 fewer. And in the last 9 years, when there should have been 4 or 5, there was 1. So, why is this a problem? It's a problem because it gives an opening to anyone who wishes to attack the notion of global warming as being a serious issue. Because they can look up these numbers too, they're all available on the web, and the ones from the National Hurricane Center are probably reasonably reliable. I must say I didn't experience all those hurricanes myself, so I can't be sure, but I think they are. And they can say, look, there's absolutely no evidence that global warming is leading to more massive, more powerful, or more numerous storms. And that's the case. It's just a fact. We need to distinguish facts from models, from predictions, and from opinions. And I think scientists are particularly bad at doing that. I think scientists also have other problems. As you heard about in the last talk, briefly mentioned, the reproducibility problem in psychology. A massive study was done with 235 published studies in peer-reviewed journals of psychological results over the last 20 years, and of those, only 33% were reproducible, and that's reproducible at a p equals 0.05 level, which a physical scientist would never accept as even serious. But the reproducibility problem in medicine is even more severe. I don't know if you know this, but about 10 years ago, Amgen picked out 53 studies that had been published in the leading journals in Europe and the United States, and were touted in the editorial of the journal in which the peer-reviewed paper appeared as breakthrough articles. These were in clinical and preclinical studies of cancer, both in petri dishes and in mouse models. And they spent a huge amount of money and a huge amount of time attempting to reproduce, according to the articles, these 53 studies. And they found that 47 of them, 89%, were irreproducible. And more troubling, when they went back to the original authors of all these irreproducible results and showed them the data, asked for their original data, and asked to collaborate on a test of this to follow up, they were confronted with lawyers who asked them to sign non-disclosure agreements to make sure that that original publication in that leading journal was never called into question. This is a serious problem if we want scientists and science and rational thinking to be accepted as a reasonable way of doing things. You know, the thing about the hurricanes, even if it were true that there was a correlation between the number or the strength of hurricanes and the temperature, it's still just a correlation. If you want information on correlation and causation, I highly recommend Tyler Vegan's website. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but he's taken tens of thousands of data sets and correlated with each other and come up with brilliant correlations. The favorite one is 99.3% correlation, almost a perfect line between national margarine consumption and the divorce rate in Maine. He has dozens of these on there. Another good one is 1990 to 2010, the number of bee colonies is perfectly correlated with the rate of juvenile arrests for marijuana. And I looked up, it doesn't appear that bees pollinate marijuana, so it's probably not an issue. A recent article in the Washington Post on this issue of the election being rigged claimed in its headline that there were 31 incidences of voter fraud over the last 1 billion ballots cast in the United States. You might say, well, yeah, see, I knew this Trump thing is just ridiculous. But see, it conforms to your point of view. That statement is totally absurd on the face of it. And if you read the article, and then you went to the article about which the article was written, you found that the author didn't claim that at all. They claimed there were 31 cases of people too dumb to walk in with someone else's ID and attempt to vote, but the number of voter fraud cases is vastly greater than this. Respect for numbers and care in presenting them is absolutely critical. I'll close, though, with something that I found so depressing when I was writing the book. I was on the last chapter, I almost stopped. And that's research by Dan Kahan at Yale University Law School. Dan is an expert on science communication. In particular, he's recently focused on communicating about climate change to the public. And so he did a large sample, randomly, perfectly selected, 1,800 US adults, and he gave them 3 tests. One was a test of their cognitive reasoning ability. It wasn't exactly an IQ test, but it was a fairly sophisticated test to see what high-level cognitive reasoning ability people had. And so to be crude, you had the dumb people and the smart people, if you want. But there was a big spread in cognitive reasoning ability. Again, gave them a test on their knowledge of climate change, the facts about climate change. And he gave them a third test on their political affiliation, far left to the far right. And what he saw was really quite shocking. He found that the people who denied that climate change exists to the people who thought it was the greatest threat humanity has faced had about the same knowledge about climate change. They got the easy questions right, they got the hard questions wrong. It wasn't a lack of knowledge, it wasn't a lack of scientific literacy at all. He also found that when he asked them to rate the risk of climate change from 0 to 7, that the people on the low cognitive reasoning ability end, independent of their political affiliation, said, it's about a 3, maybe it's a 2, I don't know. It was not 0, and it was not 7, it was somewhere in between. But then, as he plotted across the political spectrum, going to the right and to the left, the graph went like this. So that when you went to the right-wing people with the highest cognitive reasoning ability, they said there was a 0 risk posed by climate change. And when you went to the highest cognitive reasoning ability of people on the left, they said it was a total catastrophe for the Earth. And what his conclusion is from this, I think, is sobering for all of us. And that is, today, in this internet-saturated age, people have the facility to get data. And they use their cognitive reasoning ability to reinforce their group identity, not to rationally analyze that data. And this is the problem that we need to confront. How to do that, I'm not sure, but you could all start by reading my book, which I'm happy to sign.